Hello class. Today's lecture is on Gestalt, which has to do with the principles of visual perception. This should be a pretty quick lecture, but I think it will be really impactful for your logo design process. So let's get started. Okay, the transition will make you all not fall asleep today. Okay, so Gestalt and logo design. The human brain is really good at filling in the blanks in images and creating a whole that is greater than its parts. That's why we see things like, faces in clouds or in sidewalk cracks. It's why we can see interesting shapes within like the negative spaces of different objects, like the arrow in the FedEx logo, or the eyeballs in the logo look on this slide. Our brains are also really good at taking a bunch of disparate parts and putting them together to see a whole, like in that Woodworks logo where all those black elements, we see saw blade, even though it's made up of some filled in shape, but some like scrolly shape to fill that whole arch. Our brain still understands that that whole thing is showing you saw blade, right? So those are just 3 examples of how the human brain is wired in a certain way for seeing these different, our brain is built basically to see structures and patterns so that we can better understand the environment we're living in. And if we understand the way the human brain works and the way the human brain perceives different shapes and elements, that will help us as designers to not only improve our aesthetics of our logos, but also their functionality and their readability or their user-friendliness. So the simplest terms, the definition of Gestalt theory is Gestalt theory is based on the idea that the human brain will attempt to simplify and organize complex images or designs that consist of many elements by subconsciously arranging the parts into an organized system that creates a whole rather than just a series of disparate elements. And we're going to go through, I think there's 8 principles that I have here of Gestalt perception and look at what the definition of each principle is and how that could play into our logo designs. And then at the end of the lecture, there will be a quick exercise for you guys to try to deconstruct or tell me what Gestalt principle or principles are at play in a couple different logos to see if you can start to understand how this works with our logo design. Should be fun. Whew, okay. So the first principle we're going to go through is similarity. Okay, so similarity is all about similar elements that are visually grouped regardless of their relative proximity. So in this visual, we've got some gray squares and some green squares. And so our brains immediately sort those however many squares there are 2 groups of squares, right? So we're grouping all of the gray squares together as one item and all the green squares together as one item, even though they're like randomly scattered about the grid, whether they're super far apart from each other, our brain is still just grouping it into 2 separate groups because those are the groups with similar properties, right? Gray versus green. So that's what this principle is all about. So here's just a couple logos that are playing off of this principle of similarity. So the eagle logo, the triangles that are forming a sun, right, around the outside of the eagle. Those different triangles, our brains are grouping into one shape, sun, even though they are not in any other way organized to represent sun, as well as the Statue of Liberty one is probably a little more abstract even, so all of those random angular shapes I think we all see Statue of Liberty made up of those different shapes. So again, our brains are just grouping these shapes together to form a larger image or to form a whole unit versus disparate items. Okay, so that's similarity. Anomaly. Anomaly is when like elements are broken up by an element that breaks the pattern or is dissimilar to the others. So the attention is drawn to the differing element. So in this one, right, we've got a grid of circles and then I've got horizontal banner going through it. Your eye is naturally drawn to the horizontal banner, to the thing that is dissimilar to the rest, the thing that's breaking, like, breaking the visual. That's why you a lot of times will see, the big call to action, the big like stop here, play now, whatever in, a banner, maybe even like a horizontal banner, like over an image, because that immediately draws your attention to it, right? Like sale or coming soon or whatever. Those little banners are using this principle of anomaly. So here's just two visual examples of anomaly at play. So the first one, Val Bakery and Bar and Kitchen. The red banner going across this logo is obviously the focal point, and your eye is just naturally drawn to the horizontal shape. I mean, it's red, so it's double drawing your attention to it, but the horizontal shape breaking the overall organic circle of the logo is playing off of this idea of anomaly. And then with the little paper cutout people, the guy at the end who's broken free and he's jumping for joy, he's breaking the pattern so that he is the anomaly. He is where your eye is being drawn to as the focal point, since he is different than the other three guys. Okay, our next principle is called continuation. So continuation is talking about how the human eye will follow the smoothest path when viewing lines. So when you looked at these lines, does your eye assume like all the red is one path, like your eye follows the red dots and your eye follows the gray dots, even though the smoothest path could be really just straight across or in that nice swoop but it changes colors halfway through. And so I think the idea of similarity comes into play here too, because my eye is grouping all the red dots as a thing and all the gray dots as a thing. But continuation kind of wants my eye just kind of wants to go straight across from the gray to the red. So it's two different principles fighting one another at play here. But the definition being that your human eye will follow the smoothest path when viewing lines. So let's see that in play with some logos. So here, this heaven logo, again, the red is helping to reinforce this principle, but your eye naturally goes straight across the pitchfork of the E versus stopping and reading the H first. So first you see the line taking you all the way to the E and you read pitchfork, and then you kind of like circle back and read heaven. At least that's how my eyes are perceiving this logo design. Okay, the next one is proximity. How close elements are to one another to create a group association between objects. So this is the same design principle you've probably covered in other design courses as well, proximity. So the grid of circles on the left, they're all equally spaced, so it's reading as one grouping of dots, versus the groupings on the right, they're spaced a little bit differently. So now all of a sudden your brain is grouping these dots into 3 columns of dots, right? So that's the principle of proximity. So some examples of proximity in play would be these 2 logos where the city library, those horizontal or those vertical green rectangles are all put close together and kind of tilty where they look like spines of books, right? So I'm grouping all those things as a row of book spines, reinforced obviously by the name library, but my eye is grouping them as one unit. And then same thing with that Motoland Asia, those gears or whatever you want to call them, the visuals. The way they've been placed, I'm grouping those things as reading like a letter M. So there you go, proximity. Okay, closure. This is a good one. Your brain will fill in the missing parts of a design or image to create a whole. So this is obviously a picture of a panda bear, but if you actually look at the logo, the shape of the panda's head, like the top between the ears, is not actually drawn in. Same thing with to the right of the one ear and on the panda's back. So the artist hasn't drawn in the full shape, so we get the full outline of panda bear, but everyone sees the panda bear and no one is confused by what is this an illustration of, because our brains are very good at just filling in the missing parts and to close the shapes for us naturally to be like, it's a panda bear. So that's the principle of closure. And here are a couple logos using that idea. So the one on the left is like a dog bone, but it's also a dog face, right? So because you see the eyes to the sides of the bone. And I think the principle of closure is at play because our brains just are like, it's a face. I understand that there's a outline to this face somewhere that I'm not seeing. I can understand face. And then same thing with the Abby's gift. I think the closure comes into play with it's a bow, but it's also a butterfly with those little antenna above the bow. And the antenna aren't touching the bow, but you're still using them together and your brain can fill in the gap to be like, oh, it's also a butterfly. And a lot of these logos, you could argue for additional Gestalt principles that are also in play to make a lot of these designs work. So there's a lot of, I would say you could definitely fight to the death over which principles you think are at play. And if we were in class together, we would definitely play that game. So if you're disagreeing with me in your head, that is totally fine. And you are also right. All right, so this next principle is figure ground. Your brain will interpret the larger area of an image as the ground and the smaller as the figure. Your brain will also interpret the most recognizable shape as figure and the more amorphous shape as ground. And where it comes in, where this Gestalt principle is really about is all of those fun pictures where you're like, is it a candlestick? Is it 2 faces? In this image, is it a tree or is it a gorilla and a lion looking at each other? Right? So figure ground is really about that fooling the eye where there is visual information in both the figure and the ground, and your brain has a hard time picking out which is the figure and which is the ground. So I think this one always comes up with fun logos. You see a lot of these fun logos on the internet, and I am challenging you guys to try to come up with your own figure ground logos in our project. So this is the principle that we are gonna try to make stuff with. So here's swings, right? The negative space of the W is also a swing. And hourglass, it could be a black H, or it could be the negative space of a white hourglass, right? So that tricking the eye where the thing that you're looking at could be the positive or it could be the negative. That's literally the play of figure ground. That's the principle that we're talking about. So those are fun. Okay, a couple more. The next one is symmetry and order. So this one is all about how your brain will perceive ambiguous shapes in the simplest manner. So that thing on the left, when you look at it, do you go, oh, I have no idea what that is? Or do you go, oh, it looks like a circle with a triangle and a square? Your brain sorting that more amorphic shape into basic geometric shapes that you're familiar with is the principle of order. Same thing with that picture of a fire hydrant. It looks like a cute little face, right? Because our brains naturally look for faces in the world. So that's why we see faces in a lot of, just random objects like this. And then symmetry is also going to be about, things that are symmetrical. Again, things that there's balance to. Our brain likes symmetry and balance. So it will try to find that balance and in visuals. So we saw that look logo in the beginning of this deck, right? The O's look like eyes. There you go. And then the antiparticle, all those little circles are again forming this letter A, which again, our brain is going to find a simple shape in the ambiguity. So within the cluster of circles, your brain is pulling out that A, which again, is very similar to other principles like similarity and proximity. I think you could make the case for both of those principles also helping this A in antiparticle, but it is also working on the idea of symmetry and order. Okay. The last one is a newer principle of Gestalt. Since Gestalt principles were really developed, it started out in like the 1930s and 40s, that these ideas of visual perception really started to become developed. And more recently, this idea of common fate has been added as an additional principle. So this is the idea that visually grouped things that are pointing to or moving in the same direction operate as one element. Think about like when you see a flock of birds flying in the sky or a school of fish swimming in the water. There's a whole bunch of individual animals, but your brain groups them again as one thing. And this one has a lot to do with movement. So it's one thing moving as one unit. So this one comes into play with a lot of like animated GIFs or animation. So let's see if this will work if I pull up. Oops. Sorry. And then the second URL, if you type that into your browser real quick, that's like the word here, and then there's a brown arrow circling the word here. And again, the different drawings of the arrow that are now, you're viewing it as one arrow moving in a circle. So you're grouping these specific individual elements and they're operating as one thing, moving in one united direction. So there you go, common fate. Okay, sorry, I'm not snazzy enough to like show that on the screen. Okay. So it's just a quick recap of the 8 principles we discussed. So we had similarity, which was similar elements are visually grouped regardless of their relative proximity. And I think you can make the case for similarity is being used on many of my logo examples I'm going to show you in your exercise. You just have to tell me why. The next one was continuation, where your eye will follow the easiest path. closure, your brain can fill in the missing pieces on a visual to complete the shape, like we had that panda bear. Proximity, the way things are arranged in relative location to the other things on the page, forms natural groupings and associations. Figure ground, when you kind of play with people's eye about like what is the figure and what is the ground using the positive and the negative space. Like we had that hourglass logo where it was the H or it was an hourglass. Symmetry and order. We will look for faces or simple geometric shapes in ambiguity and unalive things. I can't think of the word. Anomaly, where the thing that is different gets the attention. So again, a lot of times that's like horizontal lines cutting through a visual, because the disruption of the visual is the anomaly, which gets the focus. And then lastly, it was common fate, the idea of a bunch of smaller items working together to moving in a common direction. You use all the little items work together to form one larger item to create the sense of movement. Think schools of fish, flocks of birds, animated GIFs.